Mr. Chair.
Call Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I mean, this may be a small piece of legislation considering the size of the bill, and the chair of the committee upon which this bill will fall says it's it's not that important, and said they'll give it due consideration. And a lot of what the member said, Mr. Speaker, we actually agree with. But the one thing I don't agree with, Mr. Speaker, is this is a really sloppy way to craft legislation. It's a really sloppy way to control an industry. And when the chair of this committee says, well, it was a little bit of an oversight and this is a big piece of legislation and we need to get it right and there are going to continue to be these sort of amendments, I sort of wonder what sort of select committee this chair is doing. Is he actually reading the bills and the statements and the submissions that come before him? And the reason I ask this, Mr. Chair, is the important thing about this piece of legislation is it's actually about giving the right of New Zealanders to appeal against a decision made by the EPA. Now, that's not a minor piece of tinkering, Mr. Speaker. It's a fundamental right of democracy in this country. And that right is the ability to appeal against a decision based on the facts that you may put forward or your beliefs or your principles. It's not a mild, oh goodness me, we forgot about this, I'm really sorry, we'll just throw a piece of legislation in front of the House and it'll be okay. Well, luckily for Shell, it will be okay, Mr. Speaker, because we will pass this piece of legislation and we will support it to select committee. But the last thing we want to see before this House, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest is legislation made in this way. If this is such an important piece of legislation, then what we need to do is make sure before we pass it into law that we know it is going to be robust, that we know it is going to meet the democratic principles upon which our parliament is based. And so anything like this, the fundamental principle behind the ability to appeal a decision, to have your say, needs to be encoded in legislation. And I'm very, very surprised, Mr. Speaker, that this is needed. I would have thought that it would be sort of politics 101, legislative drafting 101, the right of appeal in any decision, put it in there. We are going to back this, Mr. Speaker, because energy supply, security of energy supply is incredibly important in a first world economy. There is an example of what happened when the Maui platform went down. For 5 days, it cost about $200 million. That's around about $40 million a day. So there's no doubt about the fact that we cannot afford to have this piece of really important energy infrastructure compromised in any way, shape or form. But I just think this is a sloppy way to do it, Mr. Speaker. There is no doubt about that. But there are other things that bring this into play as well, and other debates that we need to be having at the same time. This is about gas. Unfortunately, the government and the minister won't buy in to the promise of having 95% renewables by 2020. Shell Todd are going to have to make some very important decisions very soon about what they do with the whole Maui platform and what they do with the gas industry, because if we want to live our brand, Mr. Speaker, and our brand, our clean, green, global brand, which is in fact our global competitive advantage, and Mr. Speaker, in this day and age, it's not just companies that are looking for a global competitive advantage, it's actually economies and countries, and certainly small economies like our own. If we want to be living this brand, Mr. Speaker, then we're going to make global commitments to make sure that our words aren't empty rhetoric. And I think what the minister should be doing in terms of energy is sending a very clear signal, Mr. Speaker, that by 2020 we want to have moved to at least 95% renewable energy. And we have a great track record on that. Well, no, we don't. We're beginning to build a track record, but we have a reputation overseas as being great advocates for this. We have engineers who are developing world-class technologies. It's one of those classic cases where our innovators and our engineers are doing brilliant things, and yet they have a fantastic reputation overseas, but they don't have the same sort of reputation in New Zealand. But we need to move to this. I found out today a very interesting fact. Actually, the wind turbines in Palmerston North are the most efficient wind turbines in the world. They've just broken some global record for the most power generated over a 24-hour period. Fantastic. So we have the ability to do this. And we have the know-how to do this. What we need now is the legislative will to do this. They say that it's very difficult quantifying the value of our clean green brand overseas. Ministry of MB, Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, tried to do it in another guise, and they reckon it was worth about $30 billion. Which is a hell of a lot of money to us. And these are things in the areas that just cannot be copied by anywhere overseas. Our brand is one of our most important attributes, and if we do anything to diminish that brand, Mr. Speaker, we're in a lot of trouble. We're in a lot of trouble. And one of the major things we can do to actually enhance that brand is move to renewables. Now, why this is important is because what we are talking about here is prolonging the life, well, yeah, sort of prolonging the life of gas exploration. Now, it is important at this point. It makes up, I think the Maui platform makes up about 25% of New Zealand's gas supply, which is a significant chunk. There is no doubt about that. And as the First Labor Speaker, Megan Woods, alluded to, they employ about 300 people in Taranaki. It's a very important part of regional infrastructure. There's no doubt about that. But I have my doubts, Mr. Speaker, about whether this is the future of energy generation in this country, and whether the Maui platform and the whole gas exploration industry is in fact what we should be promoting in the 21st century. Now, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't be supporting this bill, and I think I've made it very clear that we will support this bill, but what I am saying, Mr. Speaker, is that we need to understand where our global competitive advantage lies. The other thing I would say is this is actually this piece of legislation is a poor way to regulate an industry. I've talked about the sloppy nature of its introduction to the House, the fact they're actually speaking in front of something which is so important to us, i.e. the right to appeal, just sort of highlights a sloppiness that has crept into this government over the last 6 years. And I think what the people of New Zealand would like to see is a much tighter, well-run government that has a vision for the future. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, we're not seeing that. In the first term of the key government, there was a, they had that tightness, they had that cohesion, and there was a bit of a vision. We saw it slip last term, and what we're seeing at the moment, Mr. Speaker, is a sloppiness that really just sends bad signals to the people of New Zealand that these guys have forgotten what it means to be a good, caring government and to put legislation in place that supports a growing economy. Because this is what this comes down to. This isn't just a minor amendment, Mr. Speaker. What this is about is the security of New Zealand energy supply. It might be minor because there's only 6 pages compared to a bill that we've been debating earlier, which is about 1,000 pages. This is an important piece of legislation. And Minister Bridges, I must admit, I know this is an environment bill, but it's also energy as well. And it goes to the heart of what Mr. Bridges was saying before. We've seen the price of fuel, for example, the importer margins go through the roof. And we want to launch an inquiry into this, Mr. Speaker. It was turned down by the Nats because the minister said he was aware of the facts and had written a letter to the oil companies, so it didn't matter. Don't worry about protecting the interests of good, hard-working Kiwis. And I must admit, Mr. Speaker, the only member for the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers also turned this down. I think he's forgotten that he actually does represent consumers and taxpayers. Well, actually, I think they've forgotten that his party exists. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, what this represents is a sloppiness and an arrogance that is most unattractive. The belief that just a letter written to all companies and it's all okay. And what this does, Mr. Speaker, is I think it begins to treat voters like they're idiots. Well, voters of New Zealand are not. They understand that when they go to the petrol pump and they pay $1.90 when they should be paying $1.20 or $1.30, then there's something not quite right. And what we missed, Mr. Speaker, is a real opportunity for MPs right across the House to work together. Come back to the bill. To work together for the common good of New Zealand, which is what this bill is about. And I suspect that every party in this Parliament is going to support this bill because we understand the necessity of energy security. But I think there are more things that we could do working across Parliament to support the interests of consumers and taxpayers and good hard-working Kiwis. We missed a trick in the energy sector on Wednesday at the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee. We won't miss a trick this time, but we want to see, Mr. Speaker, Parliament wants to see and the people of New Zealand want to see a government that returns to a much tighter a much more caring, a much more energised and a much less arrogant approach to legislation and the issues that are important to the people of New Zealand. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
Paul Foster-Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.